Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are honored to welcome you here in this auditorium where we have a chance and an honor to listen to one of the best experts in public funding, Dr. Magnus Ohman. Magnus used to work in more than 30 countries of the world, and he is probably the best expert in the difficulties of launching the public funding of political parties programs in the country. Very often it is not very well accepted by the public. There are a lot of objections to that, but I'm sure that today you'll get convinced that it is really important and necessary for Ukraine. And why, Magnus? So the floor is yours.
Thank you everyone for coming. There was a change to the law late last year, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. One of the things that it meant was that political parties in Ukraine will receive funding from the state. That change meant that Ukraine is joining the vast majority of European countries that use this form of party funding. So during the next hour or so, we'll go through what is the European experience of using state funding for political parties. I should say from the very beginning, there is no overall complete consensus about the impact of this mechanism. There are a lot of claims and arguments for and against, and we will be going through those. Before we do that, though, we need to consider why is public funding introduced. There are a lot of different reasons, but they effectively boil down to two. One is that we want to reduce the difference between rich and poor parties, to make the playing field more even, if you will. In the Ukrainian context, we also may want to talk about reducing the influence of oligarchs over politics. Oh, and by the way, state funding of parties is not going to remove the power of oligarchs in itself, but it can be one part of such a change. The second reason can be that we want to make sure that all relevant political forces have at least enough resources to make their voices heard. So in this case, we're not so much talking about leveling the playing field as increasing pluralism. Which of these is the most important? Very often you would say, well, we want to do both, which is fine. But the point I'm trying to make is that what you are trying to achieve should influence how you structure the state funding system. Don't say we should have state funding or we shouldn't have it. Say why would we want it? What do we want it to achieve? Because that will have very specific impact on how you build the structure. Okay, short history lesson. Where does this come from? State funding is originally a Latin American idea. The first country in the world is normally said to be Uruguay, which introduced state funding in 1928. But the main spread has been after the Second World War. And very influential was the introduction of this system in then West Germany, largely as a response to the way that the Nazi Party was funded in the 1930s. And it has then spread gradually, and you see a big jump in the early 90s, which is the fall of communism. Most post-communist countries introduced state funding more or less immediately after the fall of communism. Once introduced, it is very unusual for public funding to be removed. It does happen, but it's very unusual. The only country vaguely in this part of the world that has done so is Azerbaijan. So if we look at the world today, just over 2 out of 3 countries use direct state funding, giving money to parties. Significant variation between regions, though. And very importantly, in many of these countries, the amounts being handed out are too small to have any impact on party politics. But not in Europe. Sorry, green. Everyone sees that this country is green. Sorry, I forgot to change the map. Moldova does have public funding in the law books, but they haven't introduced it yet. They're in the process. Give them a few years. Belarus doesn't have state funding of political parties. You can argue that opposition parties in Belarus have a lot of issues to deal with. Money is just one of them. Switzerland, because it's a federal country, has very few rules about politics on a national or a federal level. They have no reporting requirements, for example. But apart from these, all countries in Europe now use funding of political parties from the state. So is it good or is it bad? Well, let's look at the arguments presented for and against. One claim is that it can reduce the role of money in politics, making money less important in the political scene. It is claimed that it can reduce the advantages of candidates and political parties that have significant access to money, their own money or money of someone standing behind them. It's claimed that it can give voters more choice. And this one we know, by the way. There is fairly clear research supporting the argument that introducing public funding does help to increase pluralism. It is claimed that it can help to reduce the influence of people with a lot of money over politics by giving parties and politicians access to controlled or regulated money. And related to that, it can reduce temptations for politicians to engage in corruption, to receive illicit or illegal funds. What? The arguments against Well, one is that if we give political parties state funding, that won't in itself reduce the relative financial situation. It will simply bring everyone up a step. So we need to look at public funding in combination with other rules. And as part of that, we need to acknowledge that the changes to the law in Ukraine last year also included changes to how much you can donate and how much you can spend. I'm not going to go into those regulations because we're talking about state funding. But we do need to see these rules as one whole. If you set the threshold for accessing state funding very high, it will make it difficult for new political parties to enter the political scene. This is an argument that can relate specifically to young people, because young voters tend to support new political parties, and if those can't access the political structure through accessing funding, that may become problematic. Again, in Western Europe at least, research has failed to show a lot of support for this argument. We do know that most West European party structure got stuck in the 50s, 60s, 70s. But that was either several decades after public funding was introduced, or in some cases before public funding was introduced. So that doesn't seem to be related. And of course, these countries have seen major changes to the party structure in the last 10 years or so. So nothing to do with state funding. The opposite of that is that if you make state funding accessible to all political parties, you may have people creating parties simply to get access to state funds. So creating a party becomes a business effectively. I don't think that's a very strong argument, to be honest, because you can get away from that problem rather easily by just setting the threshold at a suitable level. And we'll talk more about thresholds in a little while. A very common argument is that public funding is bad because it removes the ties between political parties and their supporters. When parties are no longer financially dependent on the people and the members, they will lose the connection to the members. That argument is nonsense. In practice, around the world, political parties depend on one out of two sources of income. It's either state funding or big donations. That's it. Those are the two options. There are some very rare exceptions. Some of the political parties in the Netherlands, a couple of parties in Germany, many extremist parties, like fascist parties, often depend on membership funding because no one else wants to give them money. And we have some election campaigns. I mean, you may have thought about the Obama campaign in 2008 became known because he raised a lot of money from a lot of grassroots individuals. But he didn't do that in 2012. Ongoing right now, Bernie Sanders in the Democrat is raising a lot of money from very small people. He's not receiving large donations. But then he's not going to be the Democratic candidate in the presidential election either. So this argument doesn't reflect reality. Much more problematic is that people don't like it. People don't like public funding of political parties. And we see that all around the world. And that's very relevant and it's very logical. State funding is your money, it's taxpayers' money, being given to political parties that people don't trust. And that's the same all over the world. When you ask people in surveys, which institutions do you trust? At the top, it varies. The bottom is political parties. Pretty much every time. But of course, we can discuss democracy costs money. And if we feel that state funding of parties, which doesn't have to be extremely expensive, is necessary for a functioning democratic system, then maybe we should see state funding as a part of the cost of democracy. Okay. Next thing is that we need to look at the size of state funds compared to the size of private funds. So what percentage of total income comes from the state? It varies a lot in the European context, but generally, once public funding has been introduced, it grows to become the dominant funding model. So this is the percentage of total income, on average, that parliamentary parties receive in different European countries. We are at average around 70%. And you can see a number of countries, especially in Southern and Eastern Europe, Central Europe, are about 90–95%. Parties get all their money from the state. In some of the countries that have very low dependency, this is a response to a specific policy decision, including in the UK, for example. So, where it's used, state funding has a significant impact on party politics. There are a lot of opinions and arguments for and against, but what is often missing is an analysis of how does the system work. I argue that how you design your public funding structure is more important for the impact it will have than whether you have it or not. And then there are a number of steps that we need to look at in any public funding structure. The first is, which institution provides the public funds? That's not important. It is very, very important which body oversees the use of these funds and oversees the income and spending of private funds. That's extremely important and difficult. I spend a lot of my time working with institutions that have this mandate. A mandate that in Ukraine, through the legal changes, is with the National Agency for the Prevention of Corruption, and to some extent with the Central Election Commission. But simply providing the funds, and in some countries this is separated from the oversight responsibility, that's not a big deal. The second issue is which parties should have access to this money. There are some countries which says, if your party is registered, you get state funding. That's very fair and very nice, but what I mentioned earlier, you will get parties being created simply to get access to state funding. And it's not helpful. So effectively all countries that have state funding set a minimum level of public support that the party must have to access state funds. Normally, that is expressed that you have to have a certain percentage of votes. Or in some countries, that you have to have seats in an elected body. Ukraine is pretty much in line with the European experience in terms of its eligibility criteria. The next is, who do we give the money to? It does happen that money is given to candidates, but it is rare, especially in Europe. It does happen that money is given to specific institutions connected to political parties. So in Scandinavian countries, for example, the women's wings of parties get state funding, completely separate from state funding of political parties. But the main option is to give the money directly to the political parties. But that's not the end of the story. Most countries give this money to the central headquarters of the party. Bim bam, that's it. But that's not the only option. Some countries provide amounts of money to different parts and different levels of the political party. So some money may go to the regional party structures or the local party structures, which has a significant impact on the centralization within political parties. So in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a lot of the money is given not at the national level, but at a subnational level. In Sweden, where I'm from, almost exactly half the money is not decided by and given by central government. It's decided by each of the 319 local government authorities that distribute money directly to the party structures at a local level. So instead of local party structure being dependent on gifts from above, it even used to be that they would give money from the local level to the central level, until that was banned through a legal change last year. The next issue is, what should this money be used for? And there are a lot of different options. The two main options is, should it be for ongoing party activities, or should it be for election campaigning? Most countries don't have a rule. They say, here is money, do with it what you will. Then some countries, like Ukraine, says that these funds cannot be used for campaign purposes. Others say that this money has to be used for campaign purposes. And of course in Ukraine we have a separate structure for reimbursement of campaign spending. There are a lot of things you can earmark money for, and through that try to influence how parties function. An experience from many countries is that parties tend to find a way of putting the money where they want it, a little bit regardless of what the specific rules say regarding earmarking. The next is the separation between direct state funding, which is money, and indirect support. So most European countries give parties access to the media, so that they get free or subsidized time in the media to put their message across. Normally during election campaigns, but it can also be at any point in time. And most countries have other types of indirect support as well. Can be the printing and the distribution of leaflets. I live in the Czech Republic. Their local party organizations have their offices in government buildings. So all eligible parties get free access to office space, which reduces their costs, potentially reduces their dependency on wealthy benefactors. Using public buildings for campaign events, using public transport. Practical example, in the United Kingdom, paid advertising is banned. Paid advertising in broadcast media, TV and radio, is banned. Instead, political parties get a certain amount on television in election campaigns to give their message. And they then also get state support through the state printing and distributing leaflets on behalf of the political parties. Well, the parties decide what it should say, obviously. And there are many advantages with indirect state funding. It's not an alternative. We should see it as a complement to direct funding or money. Advantage is that it generally is cheaper and it's easier to control how it's used than direct cash. Next step, once we have decided which parties that should be eligible to access this money, we need to decide how do we allocate this between the different political parties. So we can say that the most fair is to give all political parties the same amount. That's very nice, that's very fair, but it's very, very, very expensive if you want it to have any impact on party politics. And it does ignore the wishes of the voters who support some parties more than others. So the opposite approach, which is the Ukrainian structure, and which is the most common structure globally, I should say, is to say the percentage of money, of the total money you get, will be equal to the percent of votes that you got. Right. There are some problems with this structure too, though. Perhaps the biggest is that with this structure, most of the money goes to the biggest parties. And you could argue maybe the biggest parties aren't the ones who actually need this money the most. And therefore, a lot of countries are mixing these two structures, saying out of the total amount of money we have, we'll give part of it equally to all eligible parties, and part of it proportionally, to try to address these challenges. What's the best solution for Ukraine? Well, that's up to you. Final part that we need to look at is the distribution of the money. Right? So in Ukraine we have ongoing funding, and logically, which has to be used for campaign activities, not campaigning. Party activities, not campaigning, sorry. The purpose of that then is to help parties have a role outside of election campaigns. That's a great ambition, but not one that we can solve with money alone. Regarding campaign finance, the system used in Ukraine, which is very common, is to reimburse all or part of the expenses of political parties. This is a very logical option. It has a lot of advantages. You can see which party that's eligible before you hand over money. But there are some problems too. And the major one is that parties will have to raise or borrow money from private sources before the elections, spend the money, and then hope that they reach the threshold so that they get the money back from the state. If the party fails to do that, they'll be in massive financial problems. So it's a big problem potentially for small political parties. Okay. Final issue I want to talk about is the connection between public funding and gender equality. Ukraine, through the changes to the law last year, joined a small but growing group of countries that make a connection between how much money you get as a party and the level of gender equality among the candidates that you present. This started in Croatia and France in the 90s and it's been introduced since then in a lot of different countries. There are effectively three options. One is that you give some extra money to parties that reach a certain level of gender equality. That's the Ukrainian approach. 10% of the total amount is earmarked for parties that reach a certain level of gender equality. The alternative is a model that France has spearheaded, which is that if you don't reach this level, then you lose some of the money you would otherwise have been eligible to. And the third model is to earmark some of the money and say, this money has to be used, this part of the money has to be used for activities that favor gender equality. What's the impact? Well, just for fun, these are some of the countries that have introduced this rule and their percentage of women in parliament, with the red line showing when they introduced this connection between public funding and gender equality. Does it work? Well, the answer is very clear, and it is that we don't know. We simply don't know yet. Issues like gender equality in elections are very complicated. We need to look at a lot of different factors. France has had a huge increase. I mean, they were embarrassingly low when they started, and quite a lot has happened since then. But there are many different factors involved. We need to go in and look and try to find out what did this happen. Secondly, many countries that have introduced rules like this have only had 1 or 2 elections since. Even if you introduced this rule 10 years ago, you may only have had 1 or 2 elections. That's not enough to measure impact. But we are getting to a point where soon we can start looking at this. I have a little checklist in my mind that 3 criteria need to be fulfilled for a rule of this kind to work. The first is that political parties must depend on state funding. Right? If they get most of their money from the state, then anything you do that changes that amount of money will have an impact. But if they get 90% of their money from oligarchs, it's not going to matter. The second must be that the connection between gender equality and how much money you get must be very strong. So in the French model, for example, if you don't nominate any women, you get no state funding whatsoever. And the third, which is the most complicated, is that political parties must feel that they will lose more from not getting this state funding than they would from nominating women. Because many political parties rightly, most of the time wrongly, feel that they will be harmed electorally from nominating women. So I can't say for sure if this rule would work in Ukraine, but I say that it is absolutely worth trying, given the very low level of women we have in Ukrainian parliament today. So, we've gone through advantages and disadvantages, arguments for and against, and different aspects of state funding. The last point I want to address is the issue of transparency. In my country, political parties started getting state funding in the 1960s, and the first financial report they had to submit was in July last year. For nearly 50 years, they were given state funding without having to tell anyone what they did with it. That's nonsense. That's a lost opportunity for my country. But with state funding, you can use that to increase transparency in private funding, by making a requirement that to get these state funds, you have to submit your financial reports. You have to open the bank accounts according to the law. You have to be responsive towards the National Agency for the Prevention of Corruption and so on. So it can be very useful as a tool in creating transparency. Not today, not tomorrow, but over a long period of time. For me, if I was Ukrainian, the first question I would ask now is, to all political parties in Ukraine, you are going to get this money from the state, which is my money as a taxpayer. Tell me how you're going to use it. There are legal requirements, there is reporting and so on, but apart from that, force political parties to tell you, the people, how they're going to use that money. If they don't have a plan, well, maybe they don't deserve it. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take any questions, any comments.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. The question will be in English.
Okay.
Okay, so the first question is concerning the what for? What for is political state funding, political financing is performed? The problem here, as you said, that it is like usually it is for ongoing activity, like in Ukraine's statutory activity of parties. And you said that even the digitalization of this process won't help, like political parties won't help like for the transparency, because the political parties will find a way. But in Ukraine the problem is that if we make it like general statutory activity, and that's the case in here, we have the problem with statutes, because the statutes of Ukrainian political parties are like tabula rasa. They are very ambiguous, very vague, very hard to understand, and very like written just for specific elections or for specific leader or for specific, not for ideology, even not for ideology, but for this. And this is the problem of the developing states, I think, and in Ukraine as well. That's the first question. And the second one is rather theoretical, but maybe you have, as from your experience, is there any practice when the money is not given after the elections or after the result, but before, like a loan, and if the party reaches the threshold, then they will achieve, or rather more, or there will be taken some money from the party. And do you think that it's more useful for small parties, for young parties, to be in the system like that? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think I should answer that before I forget the questions. For the first part, there are two ways of trying to solve that. One is to say, define in law what the party statutes must regulate and what they must look like. But that is problematic. It is always problematic when we, through law, try to force political parties to look certain ways and function in certain ways. We already have these problems in a lot of European countries that I noticed that have almost all their money comes from the state. Are they still part of civil or political society, or are they parts of the state? So I do want to be very careful in going in and regulating the statutory structure of political parties. But the second option can then be to say, to earmark some of the money, say it has to be used for A, B, and C, or to say that, well, whatever the statutory requirements are, it needs to be used for certain purposes. But the most effective way of addressing this issue is to make sure we have transparency in how the money is used, and for the voters to punish the parties that don't use the money responsibly. I know that might seem a bit abstract and maybe naive, but in practice it works better in the longer term than legal requirements. I should, before I come to the next part of the question, say I've done research on the legal framework in 180 countries on this particular issue. The sharpest divide between two regions anywhere on the planet is between Western, if you will, Central Europe and Eastern Europe. Western Europe, starting about the Czech Republic and West, has very, very relaxed rules. How you don't just do anything. In my country, anyone can donate money to anyone, and any amount you will. Eastern Europe has the strictest rules we have anywhere in the world. That's very understandable. It doesn't always work. Second part, reimbursement instead of all giving the money in advance. OSCE, ODIHR, and the Venice Commission have issued guidelines for party regulations. They recommend countries to consider giving money before elections instead of after the elections. So guidelines from 2010. And the reason they're doing this is that specifically this issue, small parties, is very, very difficult to get money in advance and then hope that they will get it back from the state. Imagine you're a small party, you go to a bank and you say, excuse me, I'd like to borrow some money. I will be able to repay it if I get 5% of the vote. Well, the bank is just going to laugh you out of the building. So there are a number of countries that have tried this, giving the money in advance. Normally then saying, if you don't reach a certain threshold, you have to give it back. The problem is many of these parties that don't reach that threshold, they never give it back. They kind of just disappear. But I think you can get rid of that problem by adjusting the thresholds and the rules to a certain extent. You can, as you mentioned, also give state loans or loans from state institutions at good rates that some countries have been using. But this has to be considered, and I think one lesson is you need to change the rules over time. After each election, you need to evaluate and change the rules. So I'm not saying for Ukraine, we have a law, let's implement it, and then we see what needs to be changed. Any other questions?
I'll try it in English, and my question is, do you know about experience in some countries which refused of state funding with some time?
Well, not in Europe. As I mentioned, Belarus is Belarus, and Malta introduced it a few months ago, so they didn't have it until then. Moldova is coming on. But In the US, for example, there is a tiny amount of state funding to the parties for their nomination conventions. But the main thing there was a significant state funding to presidential candidates. But the US being the US, they made it voluntary. And the thing was that if you accepted this state funding, you had to accept the spending limit. And starting with Obama in 2008, he said, I don't want this. I can spend much more money. So he refused to receive this public funding. And in 2012 election, none of the presidential candidates received state funding. And we are pretty sure no one is going to accept it this time either. So in a North American context, that does happen, because they have special rules. But while we're on that subject, I'd also like to mention the opposite of this, which is state funding only structures. Some countries say, here is money from the state, you can use that, you can't use any money at all. You can't raise any money privately. Again, you can say it's very, very fair. We get rid of oligarchs in one go. But in practice, it doesn't work. Because what you do is to push money underground. And in the countries where we've seen this happen, some of the countries ending in stan have tried it. Very often, what the impact is that the party in power benefits, because they have access to all the administrative resources that we haven't spoken about today. So they can use that. So I want to also give the message that any rules saying you can't spend money this way, you can't get money from that way, you can only get so much, it's likely to reduce transparency. There's a trade-off between transparency and restrictions. And that's worth bearing in mind. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm a journalist, and maybe the question is a little bit different, but still. So we used to have one party that took part in elections, and they were advertising themselves as a party that never paid for television advertising, for example, and they never passed. So they were telling that paying for television or for media is like a bad procedure. You mentioned the example of UK. So I would like to hear about the influence of public financing on these relations between media and politician parties. And also I've got the questions when you talk about advertising. Do you mean real advertising, or is that about political shows or like debates like we see now? Do they pay for this? Or news, is that possible to pay for news, for example? And how does it influence actually the elections and who is elected? Thank you.
Okay. So the first part of the question, the UK, Norway, and a few other European countries have banned paid advertising. The argument is normally that you want to make the situation more fair and reduce the influence of money. This has been tested in the European Court of Human Rights several times. And they've gone a little bit back and forth. It's a little bit difficult to see exactly where the court is. But in the latest ruling, Animal Rights Defenders versus the UK from 2013, they did accept the principle. So you're allowed to ban it. There are a couple of problems, though. One is the freedom of speech argument. Why should we not have the right to give our message to the people, saying this is why you should vote for us? That's one argument. Another, which may be relevant for Ukraine, is that if you ban paid advertising, that money may float into ginsa, into hidden advertising. So the money will still be there. Those with money will still have the advantage, but we won't be able to see it anymore. So again, always think about these unintended consequences of having different rules. The last part of the question, so yes, a number of countries then organize debates, and I think that's an incredibly good idea. We should have debates not only on a national level, but we should have them Why doesn't local government authorities organize debates? Or if they don't, civil society groups organize debates. I know some do. But this is then separate from advertising time. So this is giving the Labour Party, the Conservatives in the UK get a certain number of seconds on BBC during election campaigns, so they can do whatever they want with. We're now getting to a problem that people don't watch TV anymore. You don't watch broadcasts. I mean, everyone they will download the program or they will watch the program for streaming, and then they bypass advertising. So the UK parties are starting to say, this is not working anymore. We don't get our message across. I hope that works.
I'm going to speak in Ukrainian. It was a very interesting presentation and lecture, thank you. It looks very nice, but there is life. De facto, we don't have real parties, that's one thing. Second, we don't have the parties of culture of spending money. Starting late 90s, when talking to representatives of democratic parties, both in Ukraine and Russia, they keep complaining that they are poor parties, they don't have money. At the same time, they openly talk in media and privately to journalists. They talk about money they spend, and that's party money they spend for vacations. So it looks that the party doesn't have money, but the party members can enjoy luxurious life. The same complaint is heard here in Ukraine. The government doesn't have money. Could you please contribute to assist those who are in the midst of the war? Could you please assist the hospitals? And people are tired of that. And it could be used at the election campaign by the parties as a means of revenge. So if you give up the public financing, it could be used for the benefits of some parties. Let's say in Poland, one of the issues on the referendum was to eliminate public funding. This referendum did not take place because of low turnout, but public funding could be used as the argument in our country for the parties who would like to take the revenge, just because we don't have any culture of spending the party funds.
Thank you very much. Try to take these arguments in order. State funding is not going to create modern democratic ideal party structures. No. But it can be one piece in that change. Other changes must be other parts of legal framework, but the main thing of it has to be pressure from the people about what types of political parties they have. Is this going to change in the next elections? No. But why should it happen overnight in Ukraine when it didn't happen overnight in any other country on the planet? In my country, again, I'm from Sweden, you can claim that our party structures are, fairly similar to what people say that party structures should be. But that took a couple of centuries. I'm not saying that we should wait for 200 years in Ukraine, but we shouldn't expect it to happen overnight. So the question is, what pressure do we need to put from various aspects to get to a political structure and process that we want? I sometimes use the term active patience. We have to expect it to take time, but if we do nothing, nothing is going to change. So we need to keep working for the process we want to see while being patient that it's going to take time to get there. And we will never achieve the ideal goal. if you're working with money in politics, is always a moving target.
Доброго дня.
Good afternoon. I can speak in English, but I better speak in Ukrainian. Good afternoon. Let me focus on a practical aspect. The theory is very good, and thank you for a very good presentation, though I can't agree with some of the elements in your presentation. I represent a political force, and I was engaged in the elections of 2015. I was in the headquarters. I know what funding means, and I know how much money more or less is needed to fund the election campaign. So my practical question is, depending on your answer, I might have more questions. You know that this year we are going to have the law enacted, that's the law on political parties funding. If you know the law, could you please comment on the law? What do you think about this law? What's your opinion of the law on political finance?
I'm not an expert on the law. I've read it, I've looked at it, I've gone through it. The law is better than any law we've had in Ukraine in the past on the subject. Maybe not saying very much. It is broadly in line with a European experience. It seems to me to be a legal framework that is well worth trying in Ukraine. But I spend about 5% of my time on the law when I work with these issues. 95% is implementation. I worked in countries where there hasn't been a law, but we've still managed to implement a good structure. And then I worked in many countries where the law has been pretty good, and when nothing happens. And for me, a key rule is once you introduce a law that is reasonably good, don't do anything more with it. Make sure you try to implement it. So, will the Ukrainian law work here? Well, we can't answer that until we have tried it. I think that would be my fair point. But I'm sure you have some other comments.
Моя особиста
I believe the following. I'm not going to mention the political party I represent, but I can say that we didn't we are very little short of this 5% threshold, and this 5% threshold that is provided by the law is discrimination in a way for the new political parties, for the entrance. I apologize if there are representatives of the incumbent parties, but basically this law is to support them. There is one political force whose political rating is really very low, and 440 million is the sum to fund political parties, and the political party with this low rating is going to receive more than 100 million. At the same time, we have new young political parties of young people that are not going to receive a single penny. So my opinion is that it is a discriminatory law in the way we see it now. Thank you.
I think that's a fair point. I can only mention what does exist in terms of a European standard on the issue, although it's difficult to apply to Ukraine directly. I mentioned the Venice Commission and OSCE audit guidelines on party regulation. That does say that the threshold for getting access to public funding should be lower than the threshold for entering parliament. The idea being that parties that almost enter parliament should have a right to get funding to try again next time. It's difficult to apply where you can give because of the electoral system, but the idea, I think, is very sound, that you shouldn't, once you get into parliament, you will get other advantages. You will get name recognition apart from anything else. People will know you, but consider funding for parties that are almost in parliament but not quite. Okay. Cool. Thank you very much.